The pattern appears again and again across the biblical record, stretching across deserts, kingdoms, mountains, rivers, and generations. Certain individuals move through history carrying a strange burden that separates them from the people around them. They live among others, yet never seem completely connected to them. They participate in ordinary life, yet something continually pulls them toward a different path. Their stories unfold across vast landscapes and long timelines, revealing a recurring historical reality. The people selected for unusual purposes rarely blend comfortably into the environments where they begin. Long before a crown rested on David's head, he stood alone in the hills of Bethlehem. While his brothers occupied places of greater visibility, David spent his days among sheep, moving through rugged terrain outside the center of attention. The isolation was not accidental. The geography itself became part of the preparation. The valleys, the rocky elevations, the distant pastures, and the long hours away from crowds formed an environment that shaped the future king before anyone recognized his significance. The same pattern appears in the life of Joseph. His story begins within his own family, yet even there he experiences separation. His brothers see him differently. The tension grows until he is removed entirely from the landscape of his childhood and transported across hundreds of miles into Egypt. The movement is geographical, historical, and transformational. The route from Canaan to Egypt is more than a change of location. It marks the beginning of a process that removes Joseph from familiar surroundings and places him inside a sequence of events that will ultimately influence nations. The experience of never fitting in often appears during the earliest stages of these journeys. Moses grows up between worlds. Born among the Hebrews yet raised within the Egyptian royal environment, he belongs fully to neither group. His life unfolds along the Nile, within palaces, across deserts, and eventually near Mount Sinai. At every stage he occupies a position that feels distinct from the people around him. The historical timeline reveals years of displacement before purpose becomes visible. The same reality emerges when examining Elijah. While many seek acceptance from prevailing cultural forces, Elijah moves against the current. His path takes him through remote regions, isolated streams, wilderness territory, and mountain summits. Geography and separation repeatedly intersect. The feeling of not belonging becomes part of the route rather than evidence of failure. Looking across Scripture as a historical panorama, a striking observation emerges. Significant assignments often begin with unusual separation. The individual is present within a community, yet senses a distance that cannot easily be explained. They observe the priorities of the surrounding culture and discover that something feels incomplete. They witness conversations, ambitions, and pursuits that satisfy others but leave them restless. This tension is not presented as punishment. Instead, it frequently serves as an early indicator that their journey will move beyond familiar boundaries. Abraham illustrates this principle dramatically. His story begins in Mesopotamia, within the ancient city of Ur. The historical setting is prosperous, established, and familiar, yet the defining event of Abraham's life is movement. He leaves one geography for another. He departs established territory and begins traveling toward places he has never seen. Maps of the ancient Near East reveal the scale of this transition. Rivers, trade routes, deserts, and mountain corridors become part of a larger story. Abraham's future cannot emerge while remaining completely integrated into his former environment. The movement itself becomes necessary. Throughout biblical history, moments of separation frequently precede moments of influence. Before leadership comes obscurity. Before recognition comes distance. Before expansion comes a period during which the individual appears disconnected from the expectations surrounding them. This pattern continues through the lives of prophets, judges, kings, and apostles. John the Baptist emerges from the wilderness rather than the centers of power. The wilderness becomes his context before the nation hears his voice. The apostles themselves often leave familiar occupations, familiar routines, and familiar expectations. Their paths lead across the Sea of Galilee, through Judea, Samaria, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Rome. The timeline expands geographically because the assignment expands historically. The reason certain individuals never seem to fit comfortably into ordinary patterns is often connected to the direction of their future journey. History repeatedly demonstrates that preparation and belonging are not always the same thing. An environment may provide shelter while failing to provide destiny. A location may offer familiarity while limiting development. A community may offer acceptance while restricting movement. Throughout Scripture, significant transitions begin when an individual recognizes that remaining unchanged is no longer possible. This recognition can create profound discomfort. The person sees the world differently. They notice details others ignore. They feel drawn toward purposes others do not understand. Their perspective begins shifting before their circumstances change. Consequently, they experience a strange form of separation long before visible transformation occurs. David experiences it in the fields. Joseph experiences it in his family. Moses experiences it between cultures. Elijah experiences it in isolation. Jeremiah experiences it through his calling. Ezekiel experiences it in exile. Daniel experiences it in Babylon. Each story unfolds within a distinct historical setting, yet the pattern remains remarkably consistent. The individual occupies a position that feels different from the surrounding environment. Looking closely at biblical chronology reveals another important detail. These periods rarely last forever. The isolation has direction. The separation has movement. The distance serves a purpose within a larger sequence of events. Joseph does not remain forgotten indefinitely. David does not remain among sheep forever. Moses does not remain in Midian permanently. Daniel does not remain an unknown exile. The timeline continues moving. The historical process advances. What initially appears to be exclusion eventually becomes preparation. This reality changes the way these stories are understood. The central issue is not whether the individual fits perfectly into their current environment. The central issue is whether that environment represents the final destination. Again and again, Scripture answers that question through movement. Roads are traveled, borders are crossed, kingdoms rise and fall, generations change, new locations become stages for new assignments. The discomfort of not fitting in often appears near the beginning of those transitions. It functions like an early signal that history is preparing to move in a new direction. Across deserts, mountains, valleys, cities, and empires, the same pattern unfolds. The people remembered most vividly in the biblical record are often the people who spent significant periods feeling different from the world around them. Their lives demonstrate that separation is frequently woven into the geography of purpose. The journey starts long before the destination becomes visible. The movement begins before the map is fully understood. The individual feels the tension before history reveals the reason. Yet when the entire story is viewed from beginning to end, a remarkable consistency emerges. The periods of not fitting in were never random interruptions. They were chapters within a much larger historical journey, one that stretched beyond immediate circumstances and carried them toward places, responsibilities, and moments that could not have emerged any other way. As the biblical timeline advances, the theme becomes even more visible. Entire generations witness the emergence of individuals who appear out of step with their surroundings long before their significance is recognized. The pattern extends beyond personal discomfort and becomes a historical mechanism through which major transitions unfold. Consider the experience of Daniel during the 6th century before Christ. Removed from Jerusalem during the Babylonian conquest, he is carried into one of the most powerful cities of the ancient world. Babylon stands as a center of administration, military strength, architecture, and cultural influence. Yet Daniel remains distinct within that environment. He learns its language, understands its systems, and serves within its government, but he never fully becomes part of its identity. Historical records and biblical chronology place him at the intersection of multiple empires, witnessing the transition from Babylonian dominance to Medo-Persian rule. Through every political shift, his position remains unusual. He is present within the empire while belonging to something greater than the empire. The feeling of not fitting in accompanies him through decades of service. Looking at a map of the ancient Near East reveals how extraordinary this journey truly is. A young exile from Jerusalem becomes a statesman in Babylon, survives imperial transitions, and influences rulers across generations. The separation that began with displacement eventually places him in a position of remarkable impact. The same dynamic can be observed in Esther. Her story unfolds within the Persian Empire, one of the largest political structures of the ancient world. She lives far from the homeland of her ancestors, surrounded by customs and institutions that are not originally her own. Yet the very circumstances that make her seem out of place become the circumstances that prepare her for a critical historical moment. The narrative repeatedly demonstrates that unusual positioning often precedes unusual responsibility. When viewed through the lens of geography and chronology, these stories reveal a consistent progression. First comes separation, then comes preparation, finally comes influence. The order rarely changes. The people who shape biblical history are frequently removed from ordinary patterns before they are placed into extraordinary roles. Nehemiah offers another example. Serving in the Persian court, he occupies a position of privilege and stability. Yet his attention remains fixed on Jerusalem, hundreds of miles away. The distance is geographical, emotional, and historical. He functions successfully within one environment while carrying concern for another. Eventually, that concern leads him across deserts, trade routes, and provincial territories back to the city, whose walls lie in ruins. The journey itself becomes part of the story. Maps reveal the scale of the movement. Months of travel separate the Persian capital from Jerusalem. The reconstruction of the city begins because an individual who never felt completely settled in his circumstances was willing to follow a larger purpose. This recurring pattern reaches another level during the 1st century. The ministry of Jesus unfolds across a diverse landscape that includes Galilee, Judea, Samaria, the Jordan Valley, and Jerusalem. The locations matter because the movement matters. Again and again, individuals are called away from familiar expectations into unfamiliar territory. Fishermen leave their nets, tax collectors leave their stations. Ordinary people leave established routines. They become participants in a story larger than the lives they previously imagined. The historical context is significant. Roman authority dominates the region. Religious institutions maintain established traditions. Social expectations remain powerful. Yet the people who become central to the narrative often occupy positions that place them outside conventional categories. They are not always the individuals expected to carry influence. They are not always the people who fit comfortably into existing structures. The apostles themselves demonstrate this reality. Their journeys eventually extend far beyond Galilee. According to early Christian history and tradition, their movement spread throughout the Mediterranean world. What begins near the shores of a relatively small inland sea expands across continents. Roads built by Rome become pathways for a message that reaches cities, provinces, and nations. Looking back at the beginning of their stories reveals a common characteristic. Before the expansion came separation from ordinary expectations. Before the influence came the realization that their lives were moving in a direction different from the people around them. This pattern is not limited to famous figures. Entire communities experience it. Israel itself repeatedly occupies a unique position among surrounding nations. The nation passes through slavery, wilderness wandering, conquest, exile, restoration, and occupation. Across centuries, its history unfolds differently from neighboring kingdoms. The experience of being set apart becomes woven into the national narrative. Geography reinforces this reality. The land sits at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Empires move through it, armies cross it, trade routes intersect within it. Yet despite constant external pressure, the nation maintains a distinct identity. The biblical record repeatedly presents separation not as an end in itself, but as preparation for a larger historical role. One of the most revealing aspects of these stories is the way perspective changes over time. During the period of isolation, the reason is rarely obvious. Joseph does not immediately understand Egypt. Moses does not immediately understand Midian. David does not immediately understand the significance of the wilderness. Daniel does not immediately understand Babylon. Yet later events reveal connections that were invisible at the beginning. The apparent disconnect becomes part of a larger sequence. The separation creates skills, insights, endurance, and understanding that prove essential in later stages of the journey. Viewed from a historical distance, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Individuals who never seemed to fit perfectly into one environment often became uniquely qualified to bridge multiple worlds. Joseph understands both Canaan and Egypt. Moses understands both Hebrew suffering and Egyptian power. Daniel understands both exile and empire. Paul understands both Jewish tradition and the Greco-Roman world. Their unusual positions become strengths rather than weaknesses. The very experiences that once created tension eventually enable influence. Geography once again plays a central role. These figures move between regions, cultures, languages, and political systems. Their journeys equip them to operate where others cannot. The feeling of being different, therefore, is frequently connected to preparation for movement. A person destined to remain in one place may require one set of experiences. A person destined to travel across boundaries often requires another. Scripture repeatedly illustrates this principle through real locations, historical events, and chronological progression. The story moves forward because certain individuals are willing to follow a path that diverges from familiar expectations. The result is not immediate comfort. The result is growth, transformation, and readiness for future responsibility. By the time later chapters unfold, it becomes clear that the earlier seasons were not meaningless interruptions. They were foundational stages within a larger narrative. The roads traveled, the cities visited, the deserts crossed, and the years spent in obscurity all contribute to what comes next. History reveals the significance only after the journey has advanced far enough to see the entire pattern. What initially appeared to be isolation becomes positioning. What initially appeared to be exclusion becomes preparation. What initially appeared to be not fitting in becomes evidence that the individual was being directed toward a destination beyond the boundaries of ordinary expectation. Throughout the biblical record, this sequence appears with remarkable consistency. The people remembered for changing history are often the same people who spent long periods wondering why their path looked different from everyone else's. Yet when viewed across the full timeline of Scripture, from patriarchs to prophets, from kings to exiles, and from Galilee to Rome, the reason gradually emerges. The unusual path was never a detour. It was the route itself, carrying them through the landscapes of history, toward assignments that required precisely the experiences that once made them feel separate from the world around them. When the entire biblical narrative is viewed as a continuous historical journey, stretching from the ancient world of the patriarchs to the expansion of the early church across the Roman Empire, a final observation emerges with remarkable clarity. The individuals who appeared most out of place during one chapter often became the individuals most prepared for the next. Their stories reveal that history frequently advances through people who are positioned differently from the environment surrounding them. The distinction is not merely personal, it becomes geographical, chronological, and transformational. Consider the progression of the Apostle Paul. His life spans multiple worlds simultaneously. Born in Tarsus, educated in Jerusalem, active throughout Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Rome, he travels across thousands of miles of territory, connected by Roman roads and maritime routes. His background places him between cultures. He understands Jewish tradition deeply, while possessing familiarity with the broader Greco-Roman environment. At various points he seems too Greek for some audiences and too Jewish for others. Yet this very positioning allows him to operate across boundaries that would have limited many of his contemporaries. Looking at a map of his missionary journeys reveals the scale of the movement. Cities such as Antioch, Ephesus, Philippi, Corinth, Thessalonica, and Rome become connected through a sequence of travels that help shape the history of early Christianity. The qualities that once made Paul unusual become the qualities that make his mission possible. The same pattern appears repeatedly when examining the spread of biblical history across centuries. The story rarely advances through individuals who fit perfectly into every expectation of their environment. More often, it advances through individuals who occupy a unique position between the familiar and the unfamiliar. Their perspective is shaped by experiences that others do not share. Their understanding is formed through transitions that others never encounter. Their preparation occurs in locations that seem disconnected from their eventual purpose, until the larger timeline reveals how each stage contributed to the final outcome. This reality becomes especially apparent when examining the role of wilderness regions throughout Scripture. The wilderness is not merely empty terrain, it functions as a recurring setting where major transitions take place. Moses spends years in Midian before returning to Egypt. Israel spends decades crossing the Sinai wilderness before entering the Promised Land. David moves through wilderness strongholds while fleeing from Saul. Elijah travels through desert regions during critical moments of his ministry. John the Baptist emerges from the wilderness before appearing on the national stage. Even Jesus spends time in the wilderness before public ministry begins. The geography is significant because the geography shapes the journey. Wilderness locations remove individuals from established systems and familiar expectations. They create environments where preparation can occur without the distractions of public recognition. Historical movement often begins in places that seem disconnected from influence, yet those very places become the foundation for what follows. Looking across biblical chronology, another pattern becomes evident. The people who never fully fit into one season are frequently the people entrusted with leading transitions into another season. Joshua guides a nation from wandering to settlement. David leads Israel from instability to kingdom. Ezra and Nehemiah help move the people from exile toward restoration. The apostles guide communities from one era into another. Their effectiveness is often connected to the fact that they were never completely defined by the systems they inherited. They understood those systems, yet they were prepared to move beyond them when history required it. The biblical record repeatedly shows that transformation rarely originates from complete conformity. Instead, it often emerges through individuals whose journeys have exposed them to realities beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. This perspective changes the way many stories are understood. The years of obscurity take on new meaning. The seasons of displacement become understandable within a larger framework. The periods of feeling different no longer appear as isolated incidents. They become interconnected parts of a broader historical process. Joseph's imprisonment becomes connected to Egypt's future. Moses' exile becomes connected to Israel's liberation. David's wilderness years become connected to national leadership. Daniel's captivity becomes connected to influence within empires. The significance of these events is not always visible while they are occurring. Only later does the full picture emerge. This principle extends beyond individual stories and becomes one of the defining characteristics of biblical history itself. The narrative consistently moves toward larger horizons. Small beginnings lead to expansive outcomes. Local events influence nations. Personal journeys shape generations. A shepherd becomes a king. An exile becomes an advisor to emperors. A fisherman becomes a messenger whose influence reaches continents. The progression feels surprising only when individual chapters are viewed in isolation. When the entire timeline is considered, the pattern becomes coherent. Preparation precedes expansion. Separation precedes responsibility. Movement precedes influence. The reason certain people never seem entirely comfortable within their surroundings is often connected to the fact that their story is still moving. The current location is not the final destination. The present chapter is not the entire narrative. Biblical history repeatedly illustrates that some individuals are prepared through transition because they are destined to operate beyond the boundaries of a single environment. Their experiences equip them for future assignments that require flexibility, endurance, perspective, and vision. Those qualities are rarely developed through comfort alone. They are developed through movement, challenge, adaptation, and perseverance. Geography continues to reinforce this lesson throughout Scripture. Mountains, deserts, valleys, rivers, trade routes, fortified cities, and distant provinces all become stages upon which larger purposes unfold. The physical movement across these landscapes mirrors the internal development occurring within the people who travel them. Each location contributes something necessary. Each season adds another layer of preparation. Each transition reveals another piece of the larger design. By the conclusion of the biblical narrative, the pattern stands unmistakably before the reader. The people who seemed different were often being prepared for different responsibilities. The people who felt disconnected from familiar expectations were often being positioned for unfamiliar opportunities. The people who never fully fit into one environment frequently became the people capable of influencing many environments. Their stories demonstrate that history unfolds through journeys, not merely destinations. Roads must be traveled, distances must be crossed, years must pass. Understanding develops gradually as events accumulate and patterns emerge. Looking backward across the centuries represented in Scripture, the evidence becomes overwhelming. Again and again, individuals who appeared out of place during one season became indispensable during another. The discomfort was temporary, the preparation was intentional, the movement was necessary. What seemed confusing at the beginning became understandable at the end. From the plains of Mesopotamia to the hills of Judea, from the courts of Egypt to the streets of Rome, the biblical record preserves a consistent historical reality. Those who never fully fit into the world around them were often being prepared for a role that extended beyond that world. Their journeys carried them across landscapes, generations, and defining moments in history. In the process, they became living examples of a pattern repeated throughout Scripture. The path of purpose frequently begins with separation, continues through preparation, and ultimately arrives at influence. The reason they never seemed to fit in was not because they lacked a place in history. It was because history was still moving them toward the place where they truly belonged.